Hello, class. Today we're here to talk about Chapter 6, which is related to cognitive development. So let's go ahead and get started. So this chapter, if you've gone through and taken a look and started reading, you'll see that we have a lot of research that's put forward by Piaget. And Piaget actually conducted his research by looking at his own children and his own children's development. And while he was looking at his children, he noticed that as they developed, they had this very unique way of constructing knowledge and putting things together based on how they're interacting with the world around them. So because of this, Piaget actually identified how children develop. And he said that they do so using schemes, assimilation and accommodation, organization, equilibrium and disequilibrium, and kind of this calibration in stages of development. In Piaget's theory, behavioral schemas or physical activities are what's characterizing infancy, and mental schemas, cognitive activities, are what's happening as we develop into childhood. According to Piaget, a baby's schemes are constructed by simple actions that can be performed on objects, things like sucking or looking or grasping. And he also talked about symbolic schemes. And this is when we're able to represent mentally these experiences that we have. An example of this would be a little girl sees a bird on a wallpaper. And so this little girl grabs the little bird off the wallpaper. She holds it in her hand and she says to her parents, look, I'm holding a bird. I'm giving you this bird. Well, the child's not actually holding a bird, but they're able to understand that this bird on the wallpaper can be symbolized in their hands and then provided to an adult caregiver. Older children have schemes that include strategies and plans for solving problems. And this is when we get into kind of 7 years old and older. We're going to go through each of these substages, but it's important to have a general understanding of how Piaget's theory works. So how do we gain knowledge? Well, according to Piaget in cognitive processes, there's a couple of things that need to happen. Well, first, we need organization. And a child in general has to have at least a vague idea of how to, cognitively organize the experiences that they have. So, for example, if a child kind of has a vague idea about how to use a hammer, they may also then have a vague idea about how to use other tools, right? And the child's able to do that by grouping things into specific categories. Adaptation is the process of adjusting to the demands of the environment, and this occurs in two ways. It's important to note here that Piaget actually thought that adaptation was equal to intelligence, or that adaptation itself was intelligence. So in order for us to kind of take information from our environment, we need to assimilate that experience and then accommodate it into our understanding of the world. So assimilation then is the process of attempting to fit new experiences into an existing scheme. So let's say, for example, that a child learns the word for dog or learns what a dog is. And so, you're at home, the kid, you point to something and they kind of look at it, they want to know what it is, and you say, oh, that's a dog. And so then you go to the zoo a week later Kid starts pointing at everything and saying, that's a dog, that's a dog, that's a dog, right? Well, if you're a parent, you will say, no, that's not a dog, that's a giraffe, or that's not a dog, that's a zebra, right? And so at this point, the child is then using accommodation, which is the process of modifying these existing structures in order to account for new experiences. So over time, maybe a child learns that only dogs bark. And so then they hear something meow. So they think to themselves, okay, well, this must be something else. And then they might say, well, what is that? And then we tell them it's a cat, right? So this is the process by which we are acquiring that information and then shifting that based on experiences to help us understand the world that we live in, the world that we're interacting in. Okay, so you're assimilating your existing schema to things you know, and bam, you're kind of thrown this curveball. Remember, right? So kid goes around thinking, what the heck? I thought everything was a dog. What's going on here? You're going to feel what Piaget would call disequilibrium. And that's kind of this cognitive conflict. Well, you told me that was a dog. Why is this not a dog? So here's an example. If a child pours water into a long, tall container from a short, wide container, they may wonder where the extra water went. In actuality, we're going to be talking about conservation here in a couple of slides. But here you've got this conflict. You're like, what is going on? What's taking place here? And so in order to do this, you have to resolve that conflict through assimilation and accommodation of experiences. So going back to our dog example, child keeps asking, well, what's that? What's that? What's that? And so now they're acquiring that information from their environment and then putting it together to understand, okay, dogs bark and they have 4 legs. But a cat can have 4 legs, but a cat doesn't bark, right? And so now you're taking that information, and even though you're having that disequilibrium, we're motivated to find that equilibrium, and we do that through that accommodation that we talked about in the previous slide. According to Piaget, intelligence is viewed as a basic life function that helps us in adapting to our environment, right? So remember when I talked about Piaget really thought that this assimilation was related to that intelligence. To him, intelligence was then a form of equilibrium, and the process of kind of achieving it is kind of calibrating what we know. And so in order to do this, we have to construct our knowledge. So you might ask yourself, well, how do we construct knowledge? It looks something like this, according to Piaget. So we start up here, we're experiencing this equilibrium. We're going about our day, we feel really good, we feel like we understand the world around us. And then let's go through these as examples so we can kind of really understand what we're talking about here. So a toddler who's never seen anything fly but birds thinks that all flying objects are birdies, right? So I feel really good. I feel like everything is a bird. And I pointed and I said, birdie, birdie, birdie. And so you're outside with your kid. Your kid sees an airplane and they look up at the sky and they say, birdie. Now, typically, we might say, no, that's not a birdie, right? Well, the toddler is going to experience some conflict or disequilibrium upon noticing maybe that the new birdie has no feathers and doesn't flap its wings. And so kids sitting there thinking, this doesn't really seem like a bird. And so our young kid says something like, what's that? And at that point, we are trying to help them understand that it's something different. And so then we say, okay, it's an airplane. So for that moment, the child has experienced that equilibrium. But now we have to organize that new experience. And remember, we're really motivated from a thought process to really put things in buckets. If you take social psychology, you'll talk about this in terms of prejudices, etc. And we like to make categories. That's just generally what human beings like to do. And so then what happens is we form kind of hierarchical schemas consisting of, maybe overarching ideas, so flying objects, and then within those flying objects, we've got birds and airplanes. And this can be modified again and again and again. It's important to recognize that we might move through this process several times. It would be actually very normal for us to do. And the more information we have, the more categories we may need to create for ourselves. Piaget's theory unifies experiences and biology to explain cognitive development, right? So we can think about things like motivation or this internal search for equilibrium. And Piaget says that we do this in a stage-like manner. In fact, he's actually given us 4 stages that he believes that we move through to understand our world around us or to engage in this cognitive development. So I'm going to go ahead and end here, and then in our next video, we'll go ahead and talk about these different stages in a little bit greater detail.